You make an appeal in the film to following a scientific approach to investigating this issue, and yet at the same time you're interviewing numerous experts in their field who would say they're following the scientific approach in their own study of these same phenomena. So where's the conflict in terms of the methodology of arriving at truth?
Well, these guys, these specialists, these archaeologists like Israel Finkelstein and others, they are taking as fact the fact that Ramesses II is the pharaoh of the Exodus. And then when they look at the archaeological evidence, they're telling the absolute truth that there's no evidence there. They're the ones who found no evidence for a conquest of the Promised Land within 40, 50 years of the time of Ramesses. They're finding no evidence in Egypt for a large population of Semites in the time of Ramesses II. All that's absolutely true. They're not somehow or other inventing that. They are telling the truth. What they're not prepared to do is to look at another time period where the evidence we've now discovered actually exists. So it's a methodological issue, but at the same time they are being true to their own archaeological experiences, their own investigations. What they can't do, because of this chronological issue, is they can't say to themselves, let's look earlier. Because there's implications on two fields there. The first is either the biblical chronology is wrong, and we have to push the whole system of the Exodus and Sojourn right back 300 years of where the time suddenly has to be expanded. Or we have to shorten the Egyptian chronology. Those are the two alternatives, and neither is acceptable to them. They don't want to change Egyptian chronology, and they see no way to add more years to the biblical chronology. But the solution is to reduce the Egyptian chronology, and then everything synchronizes. But they're not prepared to do that.
To answer a bit about that is that also what he's saying is that they have an assumption that has been given to them, and so what we were doing is challenging the assumption, to saying, okay, let's start from scratch. Let's say if you were to look for patterns, this is what the narrative of the Bible says: arrival, multiplication, slavery, Exodus, or judgment, Exodus, and conquest. Let's look for those 6 patterns. Let's start over, because there's a lot of new information that's come out. David would say, well, when was Jericho destroyed? Start from there. And if you look at that, that's where it pushes things earlier. So then what happened was that these scholars are standing on the shoulders of earlier scholars. And later on, we realized that those things that they were building upon has changed, but no one changed the assumption stayed the same, even though they found out the assumption was false. And so what ends up happening is that the foundation is a false assumption, and those are things that people haven't been able to reconcile, and that's why this is a very volatile discussion when it comes to academics. But if the average person says, well, what's the big deal? I mean, if you're pointing it out, and this happens in engineering and science and astronomy all the time. People have vast theories. They build wings on universities to support something, and then someone comes along and says, wait a minute, I've discovered something. Take a look at my telescope here. And all of a sudden the whole world goes, shifts over. And I think that, but that hasn't really happened in archaeology. So the other thing is that if you were given a tape measure, and this tape measure said, this is the length of time, but then you realize that the guy who made the tape measure had a flaw in his design, then you would have a different tape measure. And I think that is where the discussion is, that's the next level of this discussion.
Well, I think what you've done, whether it was intentional or unintentional, is you've illuminated one of the challenges to the supremacy of scientific knowledge that exists in our day, that we as a culture, as a whole, embrace the scientific method as sort of the main means of arriving at truth. And yet what your film is illustrating is that the assumptions that govern how they look at evidence skew everything in one way or another in terms of the conclusions they arrive at. And whether it's archaeology or any field of investigation.
That's true. My professor at university once said to me that if you sit in a professor's room in his study at a university, he has a row of bookshelves over here with all the archaeological reports in. And on this side over here he has a load of history books which are interpretations of the archaeology. He said, my row of books on archaeology will always be there as fact. But this set over here, these history books, will change with each generation because the new interpretations of the archaeological facts are continuously coming along. So the history books, our interpretation of the past, isn't the past. It's a guess. It's our best guess at what happened. It's not what actually happened. What actually happened is the archaeology. That's the evidence. And so our interpretations are changing constantly. And that's what this process is. It's a reinterpretation of the archaeological evidence based on what we know now as opposed to what we knew 200 years ago when the Egyptian timeline was established. Because we're still using the same timeline of the time of Champollion in 1822. That's when it was first established, when we first began to read the hieroglyphs. And we've stuck with it ever since. It's been refined here or there by a dozen years, maybe 50 years at the most. But basically it's remained the same ever since. But lots of new evidence has come up since then. So we have to reinterpret our Egyptian timeline based on the current evidence, not what was happening 200 years ago.
Yes, and when you start to lay it out and look at it as an overview, it's easier as a filmmaker for me to basically sort of see what's going on. And I know it's very complex, but oftentimes what we would say is archaeologists dig about, let's say, they dig a small plot of land about the size of a yard, but they dig a mile deep, you know. So they're not seeing the relationships that as a storyteller, filmmaker, that I get to see. I've talked to probably more archaeologists and Egyptologists than some of them have. They've not met all the people that I've met, and I get the benefit of that information. And so I can understand why people would be reluctant to anything else, because they've been working hard for 30 or 40 years formulating an idea, trying to interpret what they've got. And
and that is the difference between science and history. Science is uncovering the facts, so archaeology is a science. But history is not a science. It's an interpretation of the science, of the facts. So a historian's job is to interpret, and an archaeologist's job is to discover. So he creates the facts, and when an archaeologist then becomes a historian, that's when it's no longer science anymore.
In the process of making this film, you apparently have created a series of ideas for future projects. You've already alluded to that. Maybe it would be helpful just to hear what you see as your next steps.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, like we started a publishing company. So I had Steve Law, my writing partner, a researcher, and myself. I said, we have a 55-page script, but we've got so much information. What are we going to do with it? We decided to write a book. And I told my journey of the investigation. It's called Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus, A Filmmaker's Journey. But we also included a lot more information from these interviews and additional information we just couldn't squeeze into the film. That's almost 400 pages, so it's like 8 times as much information. And then we I asked David to write an updated book, and he produced a book called Exodus, Myth or History.
That's a sort of in-depth look at the archaeological evidence, historical evidence. And both books, I have to say, are beautifully produced. Tim's managed to publish them in full colour, which is a rare thing these days. So you see all the pictures in both books of the archaeological evidence. You see the reconstructions, the CGI reconstructions. So the thing comes alive when you see the imagery as well. But my book's the sort of the in-depth. You want to go deep into the story. You want to look at the hard archaeological facts and interpretations. It's in my book. If you want the journey of a man of faith making this movie, a visual story, because he's a very visual person, then you go to Tim's book. The two work together very well. And then on top of that, we've got other products as well.
Well, tell them, with lecture series. I said, well, we should do a lecture series with this. So we did a 4-hour lecture series covering...
That's right, basically I give my normal lectures to a selected audience. And that's at a different pace to the film, because we can concentrate more and spend a little bit more time in each of the arguments and the subject areas. And then, of course, you've got your future films to go as well.
Yes, and we have the movie event kit, which Bethlehem is going to be using, and which is allows people to have their own event with a pre-show and an intermission. And then we also have a box set that's coming out for Christmas, which will be, I'm not sure how many more hours, but it's going to be a lot more additional information that we're putting into it. We're going to have a Blu-ray and a DVD, and it's a great gift pack. We also have a small group study series with Kevin Sorbo, who's played Hercules, and was in God's Not Dead, the professor. He and I went to a cafe, not far from here, by the way, the Bandbox, and we filmed us talking about these questions of faith. And that's coming out. And then we also have a children's series that we've been filming called Young Explorers. And then we hope to make the next film and develop the whole body of products from there as well.
So what will the next film topics be?
Patterns of Evidence, working title Moses. It's going to be which way did they go? In Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus, we talked about the first, their time in Egypt and the conquest. So it says, okay, they were here and they went to here, but we hadn't covered where they were in the middle.
The 40 years.
40 years. Yeah. So what we're going to do is then look for options for the routes and for the mountains. And then we're going to
and the sea crossings as well.
And the sea crossing, yes, right. And then we're going to deal with the question of miracles, the question of what happened at that mountain, and we're going to deal with the writing of the Torah, and what does this really mean, and how did it impact the world. And so there's really excited about that part of it. That's going to be an amazing film. That's the big one.
Will that be another 12-year project?
No, it's going to be a one-year project, hopefully, because we know a lot more. We've created a lot of the structures. We're just trying to raise the money for it, and that's the next project. And we see then we're going to look through the Bible and continue, if we can, to create films and maybe television programming and curriculum that basically explores the patterns of evidence in the biblical narrative. That's the vision.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us in this discussion, and may the Lord bless you.